we're on.
Hello and welcome to Beaverdale Books. We are in for a treat tonight. But before we begin, I want to mention a couple of upcoming events. We've got Tom Graves. He's going to be here tomorrow night for his new book, Their Times, Our Times. And Tina Cho will share her new young adult novel on Friday. So be sure to check out the many other author events that we have planned. Midwest Bedrock, The Search for Nature's Soul in America's Heartland, takes readers on a journey across all 12 Midwest states to natural settings that defy typical stereotypes of the Midwest landscape, exploring such places as Wisconsin's 1,100-mile Ice Age trail that follows the furthest reach of the last glacier, Minnesota's Lake Itasca, headwaters of the Mississippi River, and Iowa's Effigy Mounds National Monument and driftless area. Kevin Koch has been writing narrative, informative, nature-based works about the Midwest for nearly 25 years. And prior to Midwest Bedrock, his previous books have included Skiing at Midnight, a nature journal from Dubuque County, Iowa, The Driftless Land, Spirit of Place in the Upper Mississippi Valley, and The Thin Places, a Celtic landscape from Ireland to the Driftless. Kevin is Professor Emeritus of English at Loras College in Dubuque, Iowa. So please join me in a very warm welcome for Kevin Koch.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, as Jan mentioned, Midwest Bedrock book focuses in on outdoors places from each of the 12 Midwest states, kind of focusing in on one particular region from each state, and I'll kind of explain that a little bit. The book came out just as I was retiring in March, and so I thought it was appropriate to dedicate it to my students, not just recent students, but students going back 42 years. This is how long I was at Loras College. So for my students, I've tried to teach you this one thing, that all the world is sacred. And it's kind of a good spot maybe to even explain the title, Midwest Bedrock. It's not a book about geology, although I know just enough to be dangerous a little bit. But I love geology. It's just really quite interesting to me. But it's also metaphorical that there's something central here. And it also connects, when I talk with my students about developing a sense of place, I often use a metaphor of place as like looking at a road cut along a road and the different layers. And so to get to know a place, the bottom layer of this road cut is quite literally the bedrock. Get to know how that place was formed hundreds of millions of years ago, but even 12,000 years ago as the last glacier ended, et cetera, et cetera. Get to know how that place was formed or not touched by the glaciers. Next, get to know about the first peoples who inhabited this area. Again, which would be about 10 to 12,000 years ago. Get to know the story of the First Nations people, the indigenous peoples who lived in whatever area they might live in, or meaning my students as they graduate, and all of us. And the story of indigenous peoples as Euro-Americans came to the Midwest. How did what happened in terms of their displacement, their status today, and then get to know about the earliest peoples who, earliest Euro-Americans as they came to the Midwest, and explorers and settlers and town founders and things like that. And the top is, there's always a little topsoil on a road cut, and that is your own personal experience. So make sure that you establish some topsoil in the place that you live in. And tell my students, even if you're there for 5 years for your first job, have that topsoil, have the personal connection to the landscape, but know these various layers. And that's kind of how I go about the book as well. It's not all those things all the time, but the book is both narrative and informative. usually, most chapters are my wife Diane and myself as we travel through the 12 states. There's a couple of states that are a little different from that narrative, but then there's usually some Native American history, Euro-American history, geology, things like that. So, all right, so I will move us forward. Jan told you about the previous 3 books that led up to this: Dubuque County, the Driftless Area, and then Ireland in the Driftless Area. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but just because I'm going to hit each of these individually. But just to give you an example, in each state, I'm going to focus in on one particular area of the state. So with Kansas, it'll be the Flint Hills, which is the kind of the eastern fourth of the state. What I'm going to do is take you kind of on a photo journey, but also stop and read a few excerpts along the way. I have a few that I always want to read, but I'm actually going to get some audience participation right now. If there's any state here that you want me to make sure to stop and read from, let me know right now even. Any state you'd like me to focus on?
I'm interested in the Katy Trail. A lot of my friends go down and ride the trail down there.
All right.
Yeah.
Sounds good. I'll make sure I do that one. Anybody else have a...
I've heard a lot about Cahokia,
Okay.
and I just kind of I've just heard people talk about it, but
Okay. All right.
I don't know too much about it.
All right.
Maybe Wisconsin?
Wisconsin, okay. All right, and if you think of another along the way, just let me know. This map is going to come up with each new state, drawn by my daughter, actually. But as I go through each state, I'll show you where the place is that we're going to talk about. So the first one is actually going to be Wisconsin and the Ice Age Trail. And here's kind of another drawing of it. So the Ice Age Trail in Wisconsin is an 1,100-mile National Scenic Trail. Has the same status as the Appalachian Trail or the Pacific Northwest Trail. Excuse me, it's one of 11 National Scenic Trails. Probably one of the lesser known ones. But the reason it's called the Ice Age Trail is it, in a sense, kind of outlines the furthest reach of the last glacier, the Wisconsin Glacier. Above it, glaciated land. Below it, the driftless area, meaning driftless, if you're not familiar with that term, driftless? Okay, so the driftless area, and that'll come up in the Iowa chapter as well, is this part of Wisconsin, this part of southwest Minnesota, northeast Iowa, and northwest Illinois, that was missed by basically all the glaciers. That's about 95% accurate, but edges were nibbled by it a little bit, older ones. And glaciers were like big bulldozers. They would flatten the landscape, tear down plow down the hills and fill in the valleys. So that's why we have flatlands north, west, south, but or going that way, I mean, and hilly lands in here because glaciers never flatten the areas of the driftless. Anything that great glaciers push along was called drift, and so no glacier, driftless. And cool thing about the Wisconsin Ice Age Trail is that it passes through so many different types of landscapes. As it begins over here at Interstate Park, you have something called pothole formations. And I'm going to read about that, so I won't tell you about that right now. You get up into this region, beautiful lake country. Over here is, along the Wisconsin River, is an area called the, it's called Gibraltar Rock State Wildlife Area, I think it is. And then we end up on Lake Michigan. So just a beautiful landscape. The little excerpt I'm going to read from Wisconsin is from the start. So right here, right here. They might have been gigantic witches' brew pots painstakingly ground into the bedrock, The smaller ones could be mixing bowls, and the tiny ones inverted cups for sipping rainwater with a straw. But geologists call them potholes, circular indentations in the bedrock formed when roaring glacial meltwater on the St. Croix River drained the long-gone glacial Lake Duluth. The meltwaters burst through a sandstone and basalt lip in the landscape, creating a 100-foot deep gorge in its roaring wake. Potholes formed when rounded stones as big as bowling balls or as small as marbles spun dizzily in the eddying currents and down-cut perfectly circular holes into the bedrock. Some of the larger potholes were as deep as 6 feet and wide as 12. Wisconsin Ice Age Trail was not yet on my mind years ago when I first pulled into Interstate Park on the Wisconsin-Minnesota border to wander amid this curious landscape. So this was, except for the Minnesota chapter, which I'll explain later, this was the first chapter that I began working on when I started writing the book. It was this COVID summer of 2020, so what better thing to do in COVID summer is to hike and to camp in places where you're not going to run into anybody else. You know, we did not hike the entire trail. I have to be clear about that. I interviewed a few people who did, but we hit quite a few spots along the way. So, on to Michigan. So in Michigan, the focus is on the Great Lakes shoreline. So we drove up and spent some time at Sleeping Bear National Dune, crossed over at Mackinac, spent some time at Marquette. On an earlier trip, we'd been to the Porcupine Mountains, and then finished up in Copper Harbor, sort of like the Upper Peninsula of the Upper Peninsula. And again, wonderful and varied landscape. Sleeping Bear National Dune, about 400-foot, almost vertical drop into Lake Michigan, formed when Lake Michigan was actually at a lower level, and the first part of the draining of the glaciers, melting of the glaciers. And so winds blew sand up into these huge dunes. Like I said, about 400 feet, almost vertical, almost. It's really tempting to want to run down the sand dune, except for the signs that say, you'll get down in about 5 minutes. It'll take you probably about 5 hours to get back up. And it'll cost you a lot of money if you need help. So Diane talked me out of it. So. Great waterfall areas in the Black River Falls, Marquette, rocks up on to Lake Superior. It's also copper mine country. So, so in the Copper Harbor Peninsula, we toured a copper mine that had been closed for about 100 years. And it was kind of eerie because it was a self-guided tour. So you're down about 100 feet, some eerily lit.
By yourselves?
By ourselves, yeah. And there's a few pieces of old machinery lying here and there. And then there's a little, looks like this innocent little pool or puddle over here. Except that we had been required to, watch the video before we went down, and we're told that what we were walking on was the first top layer of about, I think it's 10 layers down, so hundreds and hundreds of feet. And that pool is actually a shaft that goes all the way down. The only reason, all the other layers are flooded except for the top because that is natural drainage. So that innocent little pond could have a very deep drop. So I'm not going to read from every state, but this is one of my favorite to read from, so we'll do this as well. So this is from Sleeping Bear, Sleeping Bear. Diane and I ended our bike ride on the Sleeping Bear Heritage Trail with ice cream at the Shipwreck Cafe. The couples and young families sitting near us at the long counter didn't notice the grisly tale of Lake Michigan maritime disasters embossed in newspaper clippings beneath the counter's vinyl surface, hidden in plain sight. There was a 1912 Rouse Simmons that sank in a November storm while carrying 5,200 Christmas trees from the Northwoods to Chicago. Weighed down by the trees, the ship foundered overnight as the storm brewed. 2 crewmen sent to check flashings were swept overboard. By the next afternoon, the ship sat low in the water as rescuers spotted it on the horizon. It disappeared before rescuers could arrive. Within view of the Sleeping Bear Dune lay at least 16 more shipwrecks. Nearly 1,500 wrecks lay beneath Lake Michigan. The Great Lake winds that built up these dunes also give birth to the massive waves that take down ships. But we don't speak of that at the Shipwreck Cafe, where ice cream melts down the sides of our cones and drips onto the sunken tails. Next, we're on to Ohio. So Ohio's going to take us to the Hocking Hills State Park, a really beautiful area. A lot of rock shelter type, almost caves. Kind of an arched formation of the rock with a recessed dwelling space, really, and a lot of waterfalls coming down over the edge. Often used by Native Americans as wintertime shelters. There were a few true caves. This is one called Rock Cave that I thought was particularly enticing. It was, there were 7 of these, what I call Gothic windows, openings into the cave that ran about, I believe, 200 feet long, about 25 feet tall, and again, another 25 feet recessed. And from the outside, you could barely see, you wouldn't really know there was a cave there, but from the inside, there were these 7 openings to the outside, and they're all sort of fantastically shaped. One looked like a goose taking off in flight. Another looked like an ace of spades. Just different fantastical shapes and all. It's also the edge of coal mining country, which ran from about the mid-1800s till really about the mid-1900s, and then began to fade quite fast. So Moonville was a ghost town, basically, of a coal mining community. It's a railroad passed over, or no, this was a railroad bed that's now a bike trail, and a road passing over. And people would get up here and walk the road to the coal mines. Still has an effect on the countryside. I interviewed an environmentalist at University of Ohio at Athens who talked about how children, when asked to draw a stream, will draw it with orange water because that's what they're used to seeing coming out of these coal mines. But they are doing a lot of work to reclaim the area.
What month of the year did you go?
Oh, do you remember Ohio?
It was June.
June? Yeah. We did the trips kind of like 2 states at a time, so naturally Indiana kind of connected up with Ohio. So in Indiana, our focus is on the Hoosier National Forest. So the Hoosier National Forest in southern Indiana was originally a forested area, then pretty much by and large cleared for farming. But it was not a great farming area because the land, the soil was thin, the land's very, very hilly, and it only took like a few decades for that soil to wear thin. The 1930s comes along, and the soil is running thin, the droughts of the 1930s hit, and pretty soon farmers are going, and the Depression of course, and so pretty soon farmers are going bankrupt right and left. So the federal government began buying up land from bankrupt farmers and reestablishing the forest there. But every once in a while you'd be driving through the middle of the forest and see evidence of its past life as a farming community. There'll be a little break in the forest and a community grave garden there. Also, karst area with a lot of underground caves, etc., etc. And this is a spot I really like. You can't see fantastically here, but what looks like just to be a little path is actually a little indentation through the woods. There's a buffalo, a bison pathway. And that's a spot I'm going to read next, a buffalo trace in Indiana. We were walking hand in hand when we noticed the buffalo trace had crossed our path. Then we stepped down into the gully on either side to check it out. Bison had long ago trampled this pathway through the forest as they'd move each fall from summer grounds in Indiana and Ohio to winter grounds in Kentucky and vice versa. Native Americans used the trace as a traveling path. The French used it in the 1700s to access their trading posts. British and then American army units marched along it. Settlers disembarking from boats on the Ohio River at the ford where the buffalo had crossed traveled the route in wagons, heading west, adding wheel ruts to the hoof prints. The last bison had been spotted on the trace in 1799. Most of the buffalo trace is gone, but here in the woods it runs beside us, crosses our path, and disappears again into the forest. I imagine the long line of dust that the bison must have kicked up with the weight of their hooves, a string that would have lingered long after their passing and tied together their horizons and everything beneath the dome of the sky. Next we head off to Kansas in the Flint Hills. One of the premises of the book is to focus on places that defy the usual stereotypes of the Midwest, both in terms of the people from the coast who derisively call this the flyover zone, and even to a large degree, even us Midwesterners who might not know what's quite beyond our backyard. And so most people, myself included, before this odyssey, thought of Kansas as flatlands, right? And nothing against flatlands either, but in the eastern fourth of the state, maybe about a third, are the Flint Hills that run from about right there down a little bit into Oklahoma. It's a hilly region with bedrock very close to the surface, and because it was hilly and the bedrock so close, not much farming could happen there. And so as a result, the prairie stayed intact. So 80% of the remaining tall grass prairie in the United States is located in the Flint Hills. It's pretty amazing. So let's go to some photos there. Here you see a little bit of that Flint bedrock. Here, I wish I could go into everything, but just not enough time. But interesting Native American stories there. There is a national wildlife refuge called the National Tallgrass Prairie Refuge, I believe it is. But a lot of this land, where there's 80%, like I said, of the remaining tallgrass prairie, is private land, privately owned. And because the land couldn't be farmed, it was pastured. Now, bison are the best keepers of the prairie. Cattle are, let's just say, second best, as long as you keep them moving around and not stay in one place. So, whereas bison roamed originally, cattle are grazed now, and the prairie is still intact, which is pretty From there, these two states, Kansas and Nebraska, were in one trip together. We went to the Niobrara River of Nebraska. And again, for most people, the experience of going across Nebraska is driving Interstate 80 across Nebraska, right? Great trip. You can see off in the distance, in some places, the sandhills. And so my focus is partly on the sandhills, but really mostly on the Niobrara River. So I had a friend who grew up in Nebraska, who taught at Loras with me, and then moved back to Nebraska. And he said, you gotta come and visit, and we have to go kayak on the Niobrara River. Now before we started working on the book, I didn't know what the Niobrara River was from the Mississippi to the Missouri with a Des Moines. It is this drop-dead gorgeous river. Goes across the length of the state, the northern tier of counties. It is, I guess you could go to some photos. It is down cut about a 250-foot canyon through the valley. There's waterfalls coming in from the right and the left, and even on the river itself, it still is down cutting. My friend said that there's a bridge about here, and he said when he grew up, the waterfall was about here. Now it's worked its way under the bridge and beyond it. The river itself, it's not a whitewater fast river, but it's a swift river, and it's swift enough that it sweeps the river bottom down to the bedrock, so it's very clear and wonderful to kayak on. Fossil beds near here and to the east. Just, again, not what you normally expect of Nebraska. And the top right photo is from the northern edge of the sandhills. They are like waves of ocean water that just solidified and got grassed over. You can just see the wave action of the winds over the eons forming these. It's a very desolate yet beautiful landscape. In a way, I'm kind of drawn to those kind of landscapes as much as I am to the things that typically seem beautiful to us, like lakes and woods and whatnot. These kind of landscapes are quite intriguing to me as
It
well.
almost looks like the Luss Hills in Western.
It does have an appearance of that, yeah. Whereas the Luss Hills is, I always think of that soil as like brown baby powder. This is actual sand, but it has that same sort of appearance. So Missouri and the Katy Trails. We'll give a read on that one. So the Katy Trail is the nation's longest bicycle trail, and I think it's about 260 some miles. Follows the Missouri River till about this point, and then dips down to the southwest. Now there's spurs that, but not the Katy Trail, but still bicycle spurs that go up to Kansas City. And for the Missouri Katy Trail, this was a structure called the Quadrangle. It's at Jefferson City, about halfway across the state, the capital of Missouri. And so Jefferson City is on the south, the Katy Trail is on the northern side of the river. So to get from Jefferson City to the Katy Trail, you have to go across the Missouri River on this bike trail that's sort of like hanging off the end of a highway. But you're up here and the trail's down here, so they engineered this thing called the Quadrangle that takes you down to the level. And what struck me about this was it's sort of metaphorical of the way that I saw the trail itself. For me, the trail is layered with different kinds of different stories. The base story is, again, the bedrock, the limestone bedrock, and the formation of the Missouri River. There's a Native American story, peoples who lived along it. It's the story of Lewis and Clark as they come up the Missouri River. This is the beginning of the trip and the end of the trip. And along the way on the trail, there are markers that say, you know, on May 15th, this is where they were and what one of them wrote in their journal, et cetera, et cetera. It's the story of the railroad that was formed there, started in the 1800s. And that railroad was the the Missouri, Kansas, Texas Railroad, the MKT, or the KT, or the Katy.
Oh.
And so when the railroad went defunct very, very soon after that, was turned into, like I said, the nation's longest bicycle trail. So you can see the layers going up from the oldest to the most recent. And always there's the topsoil experience of Diane and myself riding on it. So let's look at Missouri. All right. June 7th, Thursday, 1804. Set out early, past the head of the island opposite which we camped last night, and breakfast at the mouth of a large creek. Short distance above the mouth of this creek is several curious paintings and carvings in the projecting rock of limestone. Captain William Clark. Wildlife refuges line up back to back in the miles leading to Roachport, the Overton Bottoms Conservation Area, the Big Muddy National Fish and Wildlife Refuge, and the Davisdale Conservation Area. Soon enough, we'd pass Petite Saline Creek and the hole in the rock that Lewis and Clark mentioned in their journals, just in the section I read there. In the 7 miles leading to Roachport, 200-foot sheer limestone bluffs close in on the Missouri River directly above us, shorn of tree cover. Raptors hang in the yellow-white rock walls above us. When they swoop out over the river, their shadows reel across the trail and across our backs. Now we're on to Illinois, Cahokia. So, just for the moment on the map, we're looking right across from St. Louis. So, and let me actually back up there. So one thing, again, I'll explain on the next slide, but one thing you'll notice is this location is where the Missouri River comes in and the Illinois River comes in, and not too far away from where the Ohio River all come into the Mississippi. So Cahokia was a Native American, really, metropolis of 20,000 people around the year 1100. Huge, yeah. And it's right after sort of overlapping the end of the woodland period, say in northeast Iowa, where Effigy Mounds are built. Sort of at the end of that era is the Mississippian period, Cahokia, which stretches from the upper Mississippi River Valley down to the southeast part of the United States, the Mississippian culture. But Cahokia was really their primary city. They were mound builders, some of which are like the mounds of the woodland period, such as Effigy Mounds, et cetera, but they were particularly known for platform mounds, and this was called Monk's Mound. I often describe them as pyramids with their tops cut off. This one is, I forget the exact dimensions, but it was, up until recent years, it was the largest man-made earthen structure in North America. It's huge, and you can see this walkway up, a little platform, little ledge, walkway up to the top. These were not burial mounds, they were ceremonial mounds. At the tops were probably temples, dwelling places, chieftain, shamans, things like that. And so 1100 AD, 20,000 people. Archaeologists figured that by 1300, 200 years later, it was empty. Nobody really knows why. There's no written record. One, I think probably the best speculation is it was just too big for its time. Not enough resources for that many people. Its location, however, was very fortuitous. Remember I mentioned the Illinois River comes in, the Missouri River comes in, Ohio's not too far away. The area is called the American Bottom. Very fertile area because of the three rivers there. Very easy to navigate up into other parts of the, what is now the United States, to trade with other groups, et cetera, et cetera. So, Cahokia.
Do you know how they built those mounds?
Yeah, basket by basket. There are little pits along the sides of different areas, and they just sort of scooped out from those sides and carried basket by basket by basket. Yeah.
Are those walkways original? Do they?
No.
Those have been added.
Yeah.
Oh.
I don't know though if there were. By the time they were noticed by Euro-Americans, I don't know if there were older steps, and that again asks, well, what did they look like in 1100? On the other hand, you had to get up there, so there's probably some kind of stairways you got to go. Yeah,
I had no idea that those were there.
Yeah, there's a drawing that you could probably Google, if you did Cahokia, and it's in their museum, which was getting redone this year, but the Native American Museum is very interesting. It is one of the very best indigenous storytelling pieces there is. And I believe at the end of this year, they should be done with their remodeling of that.
Where's that at?
It's here at the Cahokia
it's there.
site.
Oh.
Yeah. But they have a drawing of what it would have looked like back then, and they do have steps. I just looked there. It looks like they have some kind of steps.
Yeah, I would imagine that there would have needed to be some originally, just not these.
And that Monk's Mound is 1,000 feet in length, more than 700 feet in width, and still is 100 feet high.
Oh
So,
my
it's huge.
goodness.
Yeah.
So from the top of there, one of the things you can see 7 miles away is the St. Louis Arch.
Wow.
So that's going to be part of a little excerpt from this one. Diane and I saved climbing Monk's Mound to the end of our visit. The stairway of 154 steps ascends the mound in two segments divided by a level terrace halfway up. At the platform's top, the view stretches in all directions. Etched stone markers suggest what would have lain within sight in 1100 AD. To the east were dwelling huts, the stockade and more mounds to the west. Woodhenge and Mississippi River extend to the west. To the south, the Grand Plaza stretched out before the mound the length of a football field. So if you're up here, there was a long, level plain that was a plaza, a marketplace, a festival site. So that is your view to the west. Thousands of Cahokians might have gathered there to catch a glimpse of the high chief or shaman on a festival day. Today, of course, the St. Louis Gateway Arch is likewise visible on the western horizon, completed in 1965 to commemorate the American westward expansion. Whether a shaman with a vision 900 years ago into the future, whether a shaman with a vision 900 years into the future might have seen or sensed it back then, we'll never know. So it's just kind of ironic, this wonderful, amazing sight. Then off in the distance you see St. Louis Arch, which is Gateway Arch, which is beautiful in its own regard. It's sort of an affront to the place we're at, right? Continuing up to North Dakota, the rendezvous region of northeast. It has that name because in the 1700s, early 1800s, it was a gathering place of Native Americans, French, and then American fur traders, and Métis civilization of mixed race individuals, and they would gather there each year to trade to trade pelts and furs and whatnot, to be transported then from there onto the eastern part of the U.S. and on into Europe. Most of us also think of North Dakota as flatland. In a lot of regards, it pretty much is. But if you get about 40 miles west of the Rock River of the North, which has its own interesting story, all of a sudden there's this rise called the Pembina Escarpment. It's kind of like the edge of an ancient glacial lake. And once you're on top of that, there's a new plateau, but with some really neat valleys cut by the Pembina River. So here you can kind of see down into that valley once you're on top of the ridge. But there's another kind of landscape in North Dakota that I write about in the chapter. I mean, all sorts of other things too, but this was also this was also the site of a whole series of Minuteman missile silos. And in the 1970s, these were very quickly built, one after the other. These tiny little towns all of a sudden had this population boom of incoming military personnel, construction workers. So these towns had to adjust to that, build living quarters and adjust their school delivery systems and things like that. It was completed, I believe, in 1979. Was fully operational for one day, and then Congress shut off its funding. Now you might say, as some would say, the presence of those missile silos led to some agreements with the Soviet Union about long-range missiles, et cetera, but nevertheless, populations then tumble, right? So this one particular site was open to the public for tours. So Diane and I did a tour of that. And this one was with a tour guide. It was kind of surreal because this is the location where these missile silos had been. And the cement is leaking water, and there's wires hanging down from the ceiling as if they had been evicted overnight and get all your stuff out of here. And there were humidifiers running. It's just like, and then we came back up out of it, and a little grassy area being nibbled on by sheep, which was kind of ironic in this defense missile
Those
silo.
are only operational
For one day. For one day before they were.
all the years. I thought those were up.
Well, there are other ones, but this was a series of this particular series,
Wow.
4 of them, but still the impact on the communities was huge. So going south again, South Dakota, the glacial lakes in the eastern corridor. Again, not always what you think of South Dakota. Some photos. Kind of a Minnesota type feel. Lakes and ponds carved out by the glaciers. As you move south through the state, start getting more of these really interesting rock formations. Quartzite that has been dug through by the rivers over eons. Sioux Falls, beautiful sets of waterfalls. Minnesota, this is actually where the book began, but not yet knowing it was a book. So I wrote the Lake Itasca piece for another anthology that was going to be about the northern half of the northern Midwest states. And the editor, after reading it, invited me to make a proposal for the entire Midwest, kind of in the same way. So Lake Itasca is the headwaters of the Mississippi River. if you've been there, it's so here's the lake. Here's the start of the Mississippi River right here. It's about the width of the bookstore here. The water's about 1.5 feet deep, so you can walk straight across the Mississippi in summertime. And this one I went with my friend, Andy Augie, who was a teacher with me at Loras College. His brother-in-law was about to retire as the superintendent of Lake Itasca. So his brother-in-law took us around, showed us the state park, talked about the forest, talked about changes that had occurred naturally and man-made to the lake and the exit of the waters. But a lot of the chapter is about the, quote, discovery of Lake Itasca. For a good 50 years, from the beginning of the country almost to 1832, when Henry Schoolcraft discovered Lake Itasca, different explorers had tried to find the headwaters. But what is the headwaters? You know, you got these two little branches coming in, and why is that one the headwaters and this one not? There's a little bit of explanation to it, you know, which flow has more volume to it, things like that. But there's also a little bit of guesswork. Yeah, I think that one's the Mississippi, that one's some other river. Schoolcraft was the first to employ Native American guides. And so they led him to Lake Itasca, which actually they called Elk Lake, so he renamed it on them. But they also felt that the whole excursion was a little bit silly. Why is it, they thought, that you white people were so intent on naming this one lake as the headwaters of the Mississippi? To them, it was all one thing. Not one lake that produces the Mississippi River, it's the whole system. So how are we doing here? So Iowa, Effigy Mounds, Northeast Iowa. So when I was choosing where to write about for Iowa, I had written about Effigy Mounds before. It's a chapter in the Driftless Land. It's also a chapter in the Thin Places. So I was thinking of some other places. I was thinking the Loess Hills would be a good site. The Neil Smith Wildlife Area would be a good site. A few others, the Great Lakes area. But in the end, I couldn't not write about Effigy Mounds. It's such an important place to me. Effigy Mounds is, from Northeast Iowa, is one of the largest Native American mounds, site of mounds. Just over 200 mounds there. Many of them are conical, but also dating back to 500 BC. The effigy mounds, animal-shaped, are on the later side of the period, up to about 1200, 1300 AD. This particular formation is called the Sleeping Bears. In fact, Diane and I, some Loras students, were just there yesterday. There's 10 marching bears. They're not all in the photo here. They are marching southward along this bluff, 450 feet above the river. There is an eagle in the back, sort of like rounding up the bears and getting them in line. There are two eagles up front, as if they're sort of leading them forward. From head to tail, biggest bear, I don't know which is the biggest, but it's about 200 some feet. From wingspan to wingspan, this is about 250 feet.
What?
So they're huge. And the soil for the mounds, often, much of the soil comes from the river, 450 feet below. So, the easiest way to build a mound is to take soil from here and put it here. In fact, that's kind of what they did at Koch. So why bring up, and again, basket by basket, why bring it up from the river bottom? Again, nothing's written down, but good guess is the river is sacred, and so we want sacred soil on our mounds. Now, some of these are burial, but some are more ceremonial. And in fact, at the place of the heart in each of these animals was a hearthstone, a hearth, a place for ceremonial fires. And the Park Service just discovered a few years ago that when you line up those hearthstones, they reflect the Big Dipper on the equinoxes. So you take the stars of the Big Dipper and plant them on the landscape, and they line up exactly. One of the reasons that I decided to, or another reason I decided to write about this chapter for this book is there was a newer story, and that hadn't been known yet in the earlier books, and was then part of, had been discovered. So in this one, I went with students to tour, and we were given a tour by one of the guides at Effigy Mounds. And he had also been a Park Service investigator who had broken a case of stolen human remains. So up until the 1970s, archaeologists pretty routinely dug into mounds, and the bodies would be put on display. I remembered them at Effigy Mounds and in Museum Dubuque, and you may as well. By the 1990s, that was no longer, certainly we're not digging into mounds, and even those human remains that they had were now by law to be returned to native peoples. And so there was an administrator in the 1990s who simply didn't want to return the remains to the Ho-Chunk, or the main direct lineal people. They were no longer on display in the museum, but they were down in the basement rooms of the visitor center. He did not want to return them, so he falsified some documents to say that he was removing materials no longer needed, as if they were old air conditioners and dehumidifiers or something like that. Put them in garbage bags, into boxes, which he put into a remote garage at his house across the river in Prairie du Chien. They sat there for 25 years. At some point, the Ho-Chunk, and I don't know why they didn't do this right away, but at some point, Ho-Chunk call up, to the Effigy Mounds and say, "It's really time for you to return the remains of the old ones," is how they would refer to them. And new administrators were sympathetic to that, but they go downstairs and there's nothing there. They don't know where the remains have gone. And so the Park Service investigator was called in, and he was the guy who then was giving us a tour. And to make the long story short, he traces them back to the old park superintendent who had retired in the 1990s, but still lived in the area, and the box of human remains are found in the garage. So he's telling this story to our students and me as we're walking up the hill. And it's a long walk up. We hike for 10, 15 minutes, and he'd stop and tell us part of the story. He's a good storyteller too. This chapter is also about Iowa's section of the driftless land. So we're, we have one corner of the driftless. And so that's what this final excerpt is going to be. It's from Iowa. And kind of combination of Effigy Mounds and the rest of the driftless. Effigy Mounds National Monument is the sacred jewel of Iowa's driftless region. But the sacred goes on forever in this mystical landscape. The eagle effigy, near the rear of the marching bears, is poised to swoop out over the Mississippi River. From there, no doubt, it will glide past the exposed bluffs at Pikes Peak across from the mouth of the Wisconsin River. It will fly inland over the sweet-flowing Dunning Spring in Decorah. It will ride the updrafts along the upper Iowa River, and then bank a turn above the cornfields that wrap around the contoured hills. In a couple of wing flaps, it will circle over the mines of Spain in Dubuque, where I live, where this morning's autumn sunrise is lighting up the red, orange, and brown foliage on the river bluff, the graves of Julian Dubuque and Chief Piasta. I've seen the eagle there. I've seen its white head and tail gliding above my kayak in summer and perched high in the shoreline trees. I've seen it perched on the edge of river ice in winter, waiting for an errant bass to surface. And I know that the eagle returns each night, or when it's ready, or when it's called, to its sacred place in the soil at Effigy Mounds. So that's our journey through the Midwest. Like I said, it's kind of a combination of narrative of going to these places, most often with my wife Diane, sometimes with students or friends, and the stories that lie in the landscape, whether historical, geological, etc. Kind of pulling all that together in the bedrock image. So I can take some questions if you have them, but nevertheless, thank you for coming.
Yeah. What did you teach at Loras?
Okay, yeah. So I taught in the English department in our writing major. So I concentrated on creative nonfiction. Another professor was fiction, another poetry. And even within that, I did a lot of nature-based courses. So nature writing, Mississippi River course, writing the Midwest landscape, nature of Ireland, things like that.
I was up in Wisconsin a few weeks ago. Never seen, if you heard of kettles and moraines.
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm.
I'd never heard of those.
Yeah.
But you could see those moraines, those mounds, when they cut the corn off the fields.
Yeah.
Just big rolling mounds. The kettles were in the valleys,
Right.
like little lakes
Yep.
left over from the
Yep.
Ice Age.
Yeah. That's part of the chapter is about that area. But Diane, my wife Diane says she thinks I was a geologist in a former life, which is I'm fascinated by it. And so if you know what you're looking for, you can kind of read that landscape. The moraines are the furthest edge of the glacier. Other things are like eskers, which are the bottoms of seasonal melting rivers within. There's cames, which are like hourglass drainage of the glacier at a single spot comes down and creates.
Well, there's a state park up there called Kettles Moraine.
Yeah.
We hiked through that.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah. And that spring water up there is everywhere.
Yes.
You can drink it.
Yeah.
It's drinkable.
Yes.
You mentioned a little bit about the equinox.
Mm-hmm.
Are you saying that they somehow figured it out and had markers and so forth?
So, there's only so much I can tell at one time. But as the park ranger was telling us that the Park Service had just discovered that these blind, he then, very good friends with Ho-Chunk leaders, says to them, "Hey, we just noticed this." And the Ho-Chunk leader said, "Yeah, we knew that. We've known that a long time. We just haven't told you." Certain things that, so much has been taken away from their culture that certain things they're also not going to be too forthcoming in sharing. So they said, we're glad you figured out.
Why would they not want to share that? I guess.
I don't know about that. This particular, why not this? But just so much has been taken from them that the things that they have, they don't always necessarily want to say, "Hey, did you notice that?"
And weren't they driven from this area all the way to Oklahoma?
Yeah, so Mississippi River is down here, Wisconsin's over here. The end of the Black Hawk War, 1832, even those tribes that were not part of the Sauk were evicted. And again, part of the story that our park ranger told us is that the tribes is it's Iowa's Trail of Tears that or maybe even say Wisconsin's. They boated across the Wisconsin or Mississippi River from Wisconsin and then marched right past their ancestors' burials as they're being marched west and eventually to Oklahoma and other places.
And it wasn't real good land down in Oklahoma, I don't think.
Right.
And what tribes are you talking about?
The main tribe is the Ho-Chunk. There are, I believe, 11 tribes that are associated with Effigy Mounds. But Ho-Chunk claim the most, and evidence seems to point that way, seems to have the most direct descendancy from the mound builders. Because there was a theory in the 19th century, a very racist theory, that the mound builders had just disappeared, that civilization had disappeared, either been run off or died out or killed by Indians that, to use the term of the time, that the white settlers knew. Because how could the, quote, Indians that we know have built these amazing structures? So, and eventually that racist theory was debunked, and true, the mounds didn't, by the 1200, 1300, they were no longer being built, but that didn't mean that the peoples had disappeared or gone away or anything, just traditions changed. If you had a cell phone on you, or if you have a wall cell phone, or wall telephone, they're no longer around, doesn't mean the people who use them, that they disappeared. It's just we moved on to different things, right? So, yeah.
And David Barland Lyles, this person who gave Kevin and the students the tour, he said that the Park Service is doing a lot to try to reestablish good relations with the native indigenous folks, that they are, and they're doing a lot, and have won some goodwill back.
Yeah, he involved the Ho-Chunk and I think representatives from some of the other nations in, he kept them very, very much aware of the investigation and the circumstances after into the trial and things like that. And a very interesting fact that he said was that, so when they had gathered all the information and were ready to press charges, he went to representatives of the tribes and said, "What do you want us to charge him with? Here are a list of possible charges." And they told him to charge him with, get this, stolen government property. And that seems like such an interesting, puzzling choice. I think the reason is this man regarded the human remains as nothing more than government property, like old air conditioners that no longer work. If that's what he thought they were, just charge him with that. Wow. Really interesting choice.
And was he found guilty?
Yes, he was. Not given a huge sentence. I think he did some weekend jail time and a lot of public service.
Wow. Kevin, this is just fascinating. Thank you so much. And we're going to have some books here that he can sign, and people on Facebook, stop into the store and pick up a coffee.
All right, thanks so much.
Thank you.